This is the Chewing the Cud podcast, a podcast for the UK dairy industry, brought to you from the southwest of England and listened to around the world. Hello and welcome to Chewing the Cud podcast. My name's Andrew Jones and with me today is
Sarah Bolt.
How you doing, Sarah?
I'm really good, thank you. The sun's shining. Can't be better.
No, we recorded this podcast end of February, wasn't it? And it's now the end of March. British summertime is literally just round the corner. By the time this goes out next week, it will be British summertime. But unfortunately, the grass isn't really growing, is it?
No, it's a bit of a slow spring this year. We've had it dry, which can only be good for those that been lambing. But it's kept the grass growth down and those cold nights, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Because, I know plenty of people with cows out, and why wouldn't you with it being as dry as it is? But everyone's complaining about grass growth. And if you look at the likes of Grass, Watch, is it, and others, we've probably got half the grass growth we should at this time of year coming off the data from AgriNet. So that's the biggest thing people are complaining about is grass growth is slow, and that's definitely what we want.
We definitely need it, don't we?
We do, which is sort of where this month's podcast comes in. People might think, May, June, silaging, that's a long time away yet. But some people, if they're a multi-cut, will probably be thinking about it mid-April onwards. But as we learn from today's podcast, it's really all about the preparation and the game plan, isn't it?
Perfect preparation prevents. What is it that goes next? I didn't ought to swear whilst I'm being recorded.
Wasn't it failure to prepare is preparing to fail or something?
That's a good one, Andrew. That's probably the better way to go.
Yeah, I think that was the one that was mentioned as we recorded it. So anyway, our guest, you might think is a bit strange coming from the US, but you'll find, as I mentioned, I listened to him for a podcast last year, and the problems are exactly the same as us. That he might deal with bigger clients, but they're exactly the same problems, which was really interesting. I thought, let's have a different perspective. Let's have somebody different and see what their take on it is. And I think it's a great podcast. I know I say it often, but we could have just kept going and going. And I kept looking at the time thinking, I got to go get the kids in a minute. And it was like, we could have just kept going with him. Yeah, it was great. So if people like it, let us know. And I'm sure, as he suggests towards the end, he'd be more than happy to come back on again. So that would be fabulous. But so today's podcast, we're going to talk about silage. This podcast has been brought to you today by Chewing the Cud Limited, who offer independent advice for dairy and beef nutrition, cow signals advice and training, along with ROMS mobility scoring. For more details on these and other services available, please visit our website www.chewingthecud.com or email us direct on nutrition@chewingthecud.com. Hello and welcome to Chewing the Cud podcast, a podcast for the UK dairy industry. Farmer, advisor, processor and everyone else, we have topics and episodes that will interest you. We discuss the practical and the technical aspects of different UK dairy industry topics. We aim to make you think about what you're doing and ask yourself, can it be done differently? Listen to us speak with specialists from inside and outside the industry about their area of expertise. Subscribe and listen to episodes for free on your favourite podcast platform or sign up on our website www.chewingthecud.com for podcast notifications so you never miss an episode and links to our socials, including our Instagram, Chewing the Cud Podcast. All one word and remember no G. Or email us direct on podcast@chewingthecud.com. If you like what we do, please share and leave us a review to show your support. And that's it. Enjoy today's episode. So hello and welcome back to Chewing the Cud podcast. And with us today is our guest, Eric Dorr. I was going to say afternoon, Eric, but it's morning your time.
Yeah, it's pretty early here, but that's all right. The sun's not up yet, but when you work in the dairy industry, what do you have any choices that then they get up early and get to work. So.
Well, exactly. I think for anyone listening, Eric's 7 hours behind us, I think it is at the moment.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I'm in the Western U.S. in the Mountain Time Zone.
So I should introduce you properly. So our guest today is talking about silage. It's obviously April as this goes out, and I happened to hear Eric. I think I started following you on LinkedIn a year or two ago when you set up on your own, and then I heard you did a podcast last year. Is it the Dairy Voice podcast in the States? And I reached out to you and said, would you be interested in being on a podcast here? And you kindly said yes, and we sort of kept in touch since then. People might think, why do I want to talk to a guy from Idaho about silage? Well, having listened to Eric on that podcast, really they were the same problems as we have here. In some instances, maybe bigger, because most people think of the States as big, huge dairies. But I mean, I guess, Eric, like we normally do, tell us a little about yourself, but also a little about the American dairy industry. Because I mean, I know there's some smaller farms, like 50 cow farms, like New York State and places like that, aren't there?
Yeah, there still are some small farms in the Northeast, and yeah, in general, I think we definitely have larger farms, which you see in Europe, and of course we have the beef feedlots as well too that get involved with, and some of those are very large. But in general, silage problems I tend to think are people problems. It's you always hear dairy producers will say, well, it's not the cows, it's the people, right? It's the cows aren't the problem. Give them consistent feed, give them consistent bedding and consistent timing and all these things, and the cows work fine. It's the people that mess everything up. And in a lot of cases, that's the same with silage, because we know quite a bit about silage. We're still always learning about silage, but in general, it comes down to management, and management starts with people, right? And so, I mean, it's in the definition. It requires people to get this done, and it's the people that make some of the problems. So I've been in the silage industry here in the U.S. for a little over 2 decades now, and but I've been working internationally probably for the last 7-8 years. My last employer had me as a North American silage specialist, so I was spending quite a bit of time in Canada and Mexico in addition to the U.S. But I was also coming over to Europe 3 or 4 times a year, depending on different meetings and getting out on farms. So I think I've been to 9 or 10 different European countries. I've been to Russia on farm consulting. So what I like to do is get out on farms, look at the silages, see what's going on, ask a lot of questions to the farmer, but the harvesting crew, the nutritionists, if possible, and then make recommendations where we see opportunities. And that's really what they are. It's not it's simple to call them problems, but the really thing is, if there's a problem, there's an opportunity to make an improvement. And if we can make an incremental improvement here or there, well, then that's dollars at the end of the day in the back of the pocket. And sometimes we don't always see how large those problems can be. Particularly if that's our farm, we're on that farm every day, and we don't have exposure to seeing multiple locations. That's why I think it's good to have a consulting nutritionist that visits with multiple farmers and sees different things. No offense to nutritionists, but maybe you need to get a new nutritionist if you've had the same guy for 20 years or 10 years, because, well, you need to have a person that has, new experiences and new ideas. And that's what I like to do, because I have traveled so many different countries, large farms to big farms, beef to dairy, maize, silage, or of course here we'd call corn silage, and just seeing the different crops and how we do them and storage systems. We don't have any clamps here in Idaho, but I know we do, in the UK.
You know all the right terminology to use over here, don't you? Because I know I was listening to you yesterday again, listening to that Dairy Voice podcast, and you were talking about packing density, as you say over here. I think you said in Mexico or something, but like here we talk about it as what's the word? Compaction.
Compaction.
Whereas you were talking about packing density. But it's just interesting, because I know it's April, and it's all about being prepared, isn't it? Because I know the last 2 years we've had, interestingly, I know you've worked for both companies one way or another. We've had Sean O'Toole talking about oxygen barrier sheets, so Silostop. He works for Silostop, and I know you worked for them. And then the year before we had Colin Hansen-Orr, who works with Christian Hansen, and I know you've worked with those guys as well, so you're certainly familiar with them, and we've always tried to do that. But ultimately it comes down to being prepared, doesn't it? Because I know myself, I've had clients in the past, or went in a previous role, they ring up, we want some silage sheet. Well, when do you want the silage sheet? Yesterday. Yeah,
Of course.
This afternoon when we start filling the pit.
Yeah, and I was very lucky that the guys I was dealing with for Silostop could usually, if you put at a push, get it on farm within 24 hours. But still, it should be there ready to go when you're ready to go, isn't it? Ultimately, it starts with preparation, which for people, I mean, as we're recording this, spring looks like it's finally happening. Though fingers crossed, we need a good spring after the last couple of years. But sun's out; it's right at the end of February. And now's really when you start making those decisions, isn't it, in terms of fertilizer applications and all of those sorts of things going forward?
Yeah, you really should, because, we're all in this industry together, but yeah, we're all competitors in a way. And what I mean by that is, you and all your neighbors also need to get all the supplies, whether it's the plastic sheeting, whether it's the inoculant, whether it's fuel, parts for your harvesting equipment, all of those things. They all take time, and everybody's going to the same few resources in the neighborhood or in the area, and so everybody's very busy. And if we wait till the last moment to get prepared, well then we're obviously going to have a lot of problems.
I was going to say that's one of mine. Where you're talking about resources there. Here in the UK, we use a lot of contractors, and I'm really one of those that can't shout enough about the benefit of keeping your contractor on side, so you can actually get them on farm when you want them. So it's actually that resource as well as to making sure you keep them happy, that you're their first choice to go to rather than your neighbour.
Yeah, absolutely. And those people are critical, but they've also got 20 clients. So somebody's going to be first and somebody's going to be last, which means in general, somebody's going to get it put up too wet and somebody's going to get it put up too dry. Now that may not always be, but I mean, those are some realities that we deal with when we deal with we call them custom choppers or custom harvesters. But so those things that, how can I have a relationship with my contractor to determine how do I, if I'm going to be first, how do I manage my cropping so that I can get, the feed that I want? But now I'm a farmer before I'm a dairyman, before I'm a silage producer, before I'm a cattle feeder, right? And so there's so many things that come in here, but there is, again, it just comes back to management, and that all starts with, people. It's having a game plan is very critical in here. When I talk to Europeans, we always talk about football, and we got to go, okay, first, are we talking soccer? Or are we talking, American football? Of course, being a Yank, right? So we talk about American football, but American football for sure requires a lot of planning. In fact, every play has a plan to it.
Yeah.
And so, and there's 4 quarters within this game, and I'm not trying to convince you guys that our football version's better than soccer. But
I can name is it Brady, and that's about as far as I can. That's about as far as I can go.
Well,
so I'm a rugby girl myself. It's not football for me. So,
but when you see these team sports, okay, there's a lot of planning that goes into it. There's a lot of preparation. There's a lot of practice that goes into it.
Yeah.
Take basketball. We all know basketball better. It looks like there's a lot of things that are just, people improvising and going their own ways. But there's plays and there's plans and there's a tremendous amount of practice that goes on before it. And even the best, NBA All-Stars, LeBron James, they're still practicing.
Yeah.
Before they have a game. And yet here we show up in our livelihood, our entire way to, control our family business. That's what it is. Feed being 50 to 65, depending on where you are, percent of the total cost of running the operation is feed costs.
Yeah.
And what do? Oh, well, we needed that yesterday. Well, are you surprised you were going to make silage? I don't think you were. I mean, we've been doing it for 20, 30, 40, we've been doing it. Grandpa did it. So we know we have these activities to go that are very important. So why leave it up to chance?
It is. It's about being prepared as possible, isn't it? Whether that's getting your pit clean, whether that's having the contractor lined up, whether it's having your plastic organized, whether it's having your additive ready to go. But obviously you've got to get the grass growing, and that's obviously weather dependent, or we could, at the moment we're obviously talking grass, but you could also be talking maize or corn silage from your guys, or I mean, we obviously do a fair bit of whole crop depending on where you are and what your milk contract is. It all comes down to the preparation from as soon as you plant it or whatever it happens to go, you need to be thinking about what your ultimate outcome is, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you can't get to the, you can't hit the goal if we don't know what the goal is, and we can't hit the target if we don't know what the the center of the target looks like, if you will. So it goes back to a lot of these old adages. Failing to plan is planning to fail.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think we all agree, it's easy to to say these things. We need to have a game plan, but what does the game plan look like? And one of the things, so I do a lot of public speaking in general regarding to silage, and probably will do anywhere from 6 to 12 meetings a year that I'll go out and do this, and they'll be all over the world. But one of the things I like to always make sure is that we have a definition that we start with silage. So I have a story that I always like to tell in these meetings. So I met a guy one time in a bar, and got a lot of those kind of stories. But it's true. I was at a restaurant, hotel restaurant, and sitting there at the bar eating dinner, and this guy was, as you often do, like, what do you do? And it's hard to explain what I do. I'm a silage specialist, and like, what the hell does that mean? To most people, that would mean nothing. And this guy's like, oh, I know all about silage. I was like, oh, really? This is interesting, because if you did, I would know you. But he goes, well, I said, well, what do you do? He goes, well, I'm a road contractor and engineer. Civil engineer, and was doing some road building projects near there. And he goes, my grandfather had a ranch in South Dakota, and we raised silage there to feed the cattle. And we always knew that silage was done when we got out there and opened it, and we saw the steam coming out of it. It was like, okay, well, so you made compost.
Yeah.
And that's what you're feeding to your cattle. So, and you still go to some parts in the New England area here in the U.S., and they'll call them cook-down piles. And I'm going, what, a cook-down pile? But what they really, the first time I heard it, I was like, whoa, this is bizarre. But what in their mind, what they meant was a short-term transitional pile. So maybe if we're talking maize, which was generally where we'd see it, or corn, right? Whole plant corn silage. Yeah. So the first weeks of production, or maybe the first few days, but just say the beginning of the corn silage harvest, we'd make a very small silo of it, whether that be a bunker or a bag or a pile, doesn't really matter. And then we would get in and we'd make the rest of the year's feed, say 11-month, silo full of feed. And then by the time we got that done, then hopefully that cook down pile was ready. So it was a transitional silage that we could start feeding quickly with the remaining feed from last year, instead of opening the brand new silo and blending. So, there's some weird vernacular.
But it basically gives, let's say, as you say, 11 months a chance to cook properly, but to ferment properly before you've opened it and get spoiled by oxygen. And so it's just a short-term pile to get going. Yeah. It makes sense. It's just the name of it, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bizarre name, but then you go, well, no wonder why they probably call it cook-down pile, because it hasn't had time to properly ferment. And all of a sudden they're going to open it up. It's going to heat like crazy while they're trying to blend that in. So it's like, okay, a burn-down pile, cook-down pile. Okay, I like the concept, but, again, it gets back to, do we have a definition of what silage really is?
Yeah.
And silage is just, to clear it all up for everybody, should be ice cold.
Yes.
I've done enough research and working on things over the last few years. I've gone out on winter days and with thermal imaging cameras and silages that are colder than the ambient temperature, colder than the temperature ever reached. You go back and look through says, how does that happen? Well, there's some new technology that's out there, but it comes back to something you already mentioned, Andrew, which is oxygen.
Well, as you said, it should be ice cold. I'll just throw something at you. I remember going to, would have been an AHDB meeting here. It would have been. I mean, Sarah knows what I'm meaning, but the speaker basically said, forget about using imaging cameras, and that obviously there's a part to play in it. But he said your pit, your clamp will be the temperature that the ambient temperature was that you put it in. So if you're putting it in at 20 degrees, the likelihood is because you're rolling in air that's at 20 degrees. Where do you think, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, so we've got some interesting phenomena that happen, if you will, in silages. So yeah, and so I got to get my head wrapped around the Celsius to Fahrenheit, but we'll just do it in Celsius.
Please do, because I was listening
Is that
to you.
somewhere between like 75 and 80? I don't know.
Yeah,
in my old maths, I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's the only thing I'm not dual language in is temperature when it comes to the old imperial and metric. So please keep it centigrade.
But you have stones and all kinds of other crazy measurements too. So we can make it through a Celsius to Fahrenheit conversion. So I call it cowboy math. But so 20 would be generous for us. I mean, we in a lot of cases we'd be at 30, 35 Celsius here when we're harvesting a whole plant corn silage in September.
Oh,
wow. We're still and then imagine Texas or Mexico or Arizona, so those are some really, really hot climates. And so we could be harvesting on days where we're at 38 to 42 Celsius. And that's legitimate in those parts of the world.
That's going back to my days in Oz kind of temperature.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hot, dry, arid climates. But the point being is that, so silages will go in at what we'd say just the ambient temperature. And again, it doesn't matter what the storage system is, but there will be some of that. So let's go with your example of 20 Celsius. We put it in at 20 Celsius. Now that will be generally speaking, that's the average temperature of that feed, right? But we do know through fermentation, there is additional heat produced. So you got to realize what's going on here. So the plant, wilted crops are a little different. So let's talk just to simplify things on the corn example, because that's still the majority of most people's forages, right? A whole plant corn type scenario. The plant doesn't know that it's dead just because you harvested it, right? There's still, even though it's starting to mature, we're losing some moisture from where it was a week or two before we harvested it. It was much, the starch is settling into the kernel. All those things are occurring physiologically in the corn plant. But when we chop it, it doesn't know that it's dead. So they're still going through some respiration. And the point being, what is respiration? Well, so this plant is taking carbon dioxide in, but it's also producing heat and water, particularly. So there's some heat going off of there, right? Is what I'm getting at. The other part is that we have spoilage microbes that we're fighting, which is maybe even the greater source of it. Is those are aerobes. So like a yeast is a great example. A yeast is an aerobe, just like you and I. So we would take a carbohydrate, we would eat it, a carbohydrate being a starch or sugar in that corn plant. They would eat it, and then they would produce heat, water, and CO2, just like I am producing out of my mouth. And if you don't believe me, just huff into your hand, and you'll feel that heat, water, and moisture. And so those are all losses that we're having there. But that's some of the heating that's going on. And so, what we want to do is control that as much as possible. But just another example or way to think about this is going into a brewery. And I'm sure nobody from the UK has ever been into a brewery, but we do make beers, right? But in a brewery situation, we know when we walk into there that we can feel that heat. We can feel that moisture in the air, and we can see the CO2 because we see the bubbles in the beer, which we like to drink. But so those are all signs of that, and that's a yeast doing that fermentation. All I'm getting at is that if we put that feed in at a 20 Celsius, because of the way fermentation works, we're going to have an increase in temperature. Yeah. Now, how much is that? And that's where it gets to be the question. And so it's like, well, what other variables are involved? So we could have anywhere from a 2 to a 5 degree C increase in temperature. Now it might be 6 or 7. So, these aren't absolute numbers. Well, what would affect that? Well, if I have a long, slow, prolonged fermentation, meaning maybe I put it in at the wrong moisture, maybe we had a breakdown for a few days and we couldn't get in the field, maybe it rained for a few days, we couldn't get in the field, maybe we didn't have the compaction that we wanted because we didn't have enough heavy equipment. So many factors, right, and things that can come into play here, but anything that would delay our fermentation process from being fast and efficient, and which also means quick extraction of oxygen through compaction.
Yep.
Well, those are all things that are going to lead air into it, oxygen into the system, and then that temperature might be 5 or 6 or 7. So, anyway, as we look at that, eventually we'll close that clamp, and we're going to have a temperature, and let's just say it's an average temperature of now 25.
Yep.
Well, in the back of the pile, the back of the clamp might be greater than that because you started earlier in the season. The front of the clamp, which might be a week or 2 or 3 later, and the weather changed and it started freezing at night, that happens to us, that'd be a different temperature. So we pick a number, but it's variable from the front to the back. It's variable from the bottom to the top. It's variable from the left to the right because we have all of these different things. We have all these different moistures. We have all these densities differences. The closer we get to a wall, our densities aren't as good as they are right in the middle of the clamp. Right? Because if we can't get the tractor over there because it's dangerous. And so anyway, we pick a number, but the reality is there's so much variation and a lot of us are guilty of, they want to come in and we'll stick a thermometer and say, oh, that's the temperature. Well, that's the temperature at that moment in time, at that point, at that location right now.
Yeah.
What was that? I'm looking at this 6 months later, 8 months later. What was that at the time of harvest? I don't know. So anyway, that's a long, rambling way of explaining. There is some heat that's produced during fermentation.
Yep.
And then we have this another phenomenon that could be retained heating, right? So if I say we went in at 20, we went to 25, and I like to keep these numbers even just because they're simpler. So we go from 20 to 25. Depending on how well that silage is compacted, depending on how large that mass is, a lot of things depend here, depending on what the ambient temperature is. Maybe we put this up in the fall and we're going through the winter. Some of that heat can be retained and some of that heat can escape. So again, so think of a ag bag or some, people call them tubes or even bales, right?
Yep.
So maybe the core of that bale or the core of that silage is the warmest, but the stuff on the extremities, they're just a thin layer of plastic away from being out there to the ambient temperature. So you'll get this variation. It's just one of the reasons why I like to use thermal cameras, because it's not about picking a specific number. What is the temperature? You can see the rainbow of colors. And you'll see differences from the top to the bottom. The top will be cooler than the bottom. And it's not because it's closer to it's just because it doesn't have the mass of feed on top of it to trap the heat in.
Yep.
So, a lot of times we like to think of a cooler that we would put cold drinks and ice, a beer cooler, right? We would put, stuff in. And you can also do the same thing with a warm product in there, right? So you'll see people here, we do a lot of outdoor meat cooking, with barbecuing, we would call it. Well, if we start with a cooler and we put a large piece of hot meat in there, it'll stay hot for a long period of time. And it's kind of the same phenomenon on this silage scenario for that retained heating. So what would be different than if I put that large mass of hot meat into that cooler and close the lid? Well, I'm going to retain that heat for a long period of time, and it'd still probably be hot tomorrow and maybe even the next day. Versus if I crack that lid open, well, some more of that heat can escape, and maybe that's because I don't have as good a silage sealing on there. Maybe I didn't do a good job with an oxygen barrier. Maybe I open it wide up. Maybe if I put it outside in the driveway versus leaving it inside the house, which is 2 different ambient temperatures, the rate at which that temperature of the meat's going to change is going to be different.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the way I think about it.
Makes sense. The standard laws of physics, I'm guessing.
Yeah, there you go. Right. Yeah.
Well, as you mentioned, oxygen barrier sheets. That's going to be one of my questions. What are your takes on them? Well, I think I know your answer, but for people listening to this, what are your takes on them? I mean, over here, I'd say the majority of the market is probably a cling film. With then a black plastic on top, but obviously you do then have some sort of what I'd call oxygen barrier cling films that then you put a plastic on top, or obviously let's be honest, we've already mentioned Silostop. They've obviously got a single sheet that's oxygen barrier and with a black sheet on top. What's your take on what advantages are they? What's your recommendations? Should people be using them?
Yeah, so in general, yes, I say everybody should be using an oxygen barrier, but not all people that claim to have an oxygen barrier actually have one. So you have to do your research. And this is where it gets difficult sometimes for, farmers. I just want to farm. I just want to milk cows. I just want, but you also have to be a research scientist sometimes too, which can be difficult as well. So this is where I think having good consultants is valuable.
Say, have people around you that you trust to give you the right information.
Yeah, good advisory board. There's not a large business on the planet that doesn't have a board of directors and advisory board. So maybe you need to consider your consulting group that you work with in your farm to be that part as well. And I know a lot of people do a fantastic job with that. But But in general, yes, I would say that. And so we should use oxygen barriers. Why? Okay, so this goes back to, and of course, data was done by Wilkinson originally in the UK with the original Silostop product that came out of Italy. And that was, people still think of Silostop. It was the original oxygen barrier product. It was made in Italy and then brought through the UK into the United States. Yeah. And so that's how I got involved with it. And at the time when I first saw it in 2008, you go, yeah, this sounds good, but...
Well, I mean, a lot of people get put off by the cost, and that's probably what puts a lot of people off. But there are some big advantages to them, aren't there?
Yeah. So we do need to look at the cost of things, but it was, what is the cost of the feed? I
was going to say, given how much they've already spent to put it in there anyway, really, it's a negligible cost compared to everything else, isn't it?
And what's our alternative concentrates, isn't it? Which are probably going to be 4 times the price per kilogram of dry matter compared to a silage.
Yeah, but the other thing is that if we don't understand how a silage works, then we're absolutely discounting the value of feed hygiene.
Yeah,
which is hard to put a number on, but I'll try to come to a number here. And so when the product first came to the United States, it had been brought into the Northeast and the Midwest for a year, and then I got my hands on it and brought it into the Western U.S. And at that time, it was a great privilege of mine to spend a lot of time working with Dr. Keith Bolson. And Bolson, at least in North America, but also spent a lot of time in Europe over the years, Bolson was considered one of the silage experts in the world. He was a professor at Kansas State University for a long period of time and then retired and was doing private consulting in the industry. And unfortunately, Keith has passed now. And it was one of the reasons why I decided to start a silage consulting business, because there just isn't anybody left. I say the joke, but it's true. Everybody that was doing it's either retired or dead now. But I learned a lot working with Keith. And this is going over probably a 6-year period. He and I did a lot of the research then where on commercial silage piles, so call them bunkers or drive, we have a lot of drive over piles, but it'd be similar to a clamp. It gives you a lot of surface area. Yep. And so we were looking at what were the effects of using these oxygen barrier materials on silage shrink, particularly in the top 3 feet, or you could say the top meter.
Yep.
We'd say think of it that way. And I'll use the feet example because we're in the UK. If we were continental, we'd probably have to go into centimeters, and that's where I'd stumble again. But but we talk about the top 3 feet, and it's just simple to break that down into the top foot, the bottom, middle foot,
yes,
and the third foot, right? So we're breaking it down into thirds, or a third of a meter. So what we found very simply was if you do not cover the top, in that top 3 feet, top meter, you're going to lose about 75% of the dry matter. So very few people do that today, although unfortunately we still do see uncovered piles.
Right.
But you're just taking a tremendous loss there. So not only, and that's the easy measurement is the dry matter loss. But okay, in addition to that, unless you've sampled that material that's left and sent that to laboratories that do yeast and mold, and now we're seeing enterobacteria counts, that stuff is toxic waste. You would not feed that to your enemy's cattle because they would be dead.
Yeah.
But yet it's ending up into our silages when we do that. So in general, let's just say nobody does that anymore, right? So we don't do that. Now, when we cover with conventional plastics, the great thing is we can go from that, say 75% loss down to a 25% loss in the top 3 feet. So we've eliminated, a tremendous amount of the loss potential. So again, that's one of those opportunities, right? It's not necessarily a problem. It's an opportunity for us to improve. That just made us money by covering it. The problem is that we say 25%, but that's very variable.
Yeah.
25% is just a cowboy math number. How dense is that feed, or how well compacted is that feed? If I did a fantastic job, that number might be a little bit lower than 25%. If I didn't, because I was in a hurry, or because the weather was coming, or it was the end of the season, or that feed was extremely dry, and we didn't get a good pack dense, all these variables, right, that could affect the density in that top foot. So I could have a 25 to 30% shrink in there, just because of those other factors. Yep. So again, trying to limit our risks here and minimize those factors as much as possible. So this is where the oxygen barrier comes in. we can cut that loss again in half. So we can go from 25% to say 12% in the top 3 feet by using some sort of oxygen barrier. And the key is, though, it has to be a barrier to oxygen. The reason we're having those losses, and people have a tough time understanding this, so I'll just try to explain it simply. If we use a conventional, what we would see here is a 5 mil white on black polyethylene sheet.
Yep.
That's what we'd call it. It's polyethylene. Well, polyethylene is very porous. It doesn't look like it to us, and you can fold it up into a U shape, fill it full of water. It doesn't leak, but microscopically, it's got holes in it, and in those holes, they're at least small enough or large enough microscopically that oxygen can penetrate through them. Yep. And so that becomes the issue. That's why underneath those types of plastics, when we pull them back, normally we would see some sort of rot or crust or discolored feed there underneath them. And that's simply because oxygen has literally penetrated through the plastic and got to it. So the other way to think of this is, again, going back to that meat example. When we have packaged meats from the grocery store, or really here coming from our processing plants, they're in a vacuum sealed bag that is a true oxygen barrier. And those can last weeks and months that way. In fact, there's a way that we age meats to improve the palatability of them for our consumption by what we call wet aging. And when we're wet aging, that means that is in a true oxygen-free environment. And we only achieve that by that type of plastic. Okay, so take that type of plastic, that is a true oxygen barrier. In fact, that's where the concept for food packaging led to the concept for feed packaging, if you will, or silage oxygen barrier plastics. Yeah, it does make sense, right?
Well, so people need to remember, we want an anaerobic fermentation, isn't it? So we want it
oxygen
without oxygen.
Yeah. So the other way to think about this, let's take that same piece of meat, and if plastic was plastic, let's just take that same piece of meat, let's put it in a plastic bag that we would say to put our trash in, our rubbish, right?
Yep.
Is that an oxygen barrier? Well, you don't have to believe me or not. Just do that and then put it in your refrigerator and wait a week and see what happens. Because you'll be able to smell in about 3 or 4 days that is not the right kind of plastic to keep the oxygen off of that meat. Or for dairy producers, for cheese. We can buy a block of cheese at the supermarket that's vacuum sealed in a very high quality plastic. We can put it in the refrigerator and forget about it for months and months, and then open it up later and it's still just fresh. Why is that? Well, because we have used a barrier to oxygen, and the oxygen is what allows yeast and molds to grow. Now, it's really simple. And then so we've had that block of cheese in our refrigerator for 6 months. We now open it up. Now the shelf life clock is starting to tick. And as long as we eat through that in a normal period of time, we'll eat through it before we have yeast and molds grow on that block of cheese in our refrigerator. But if we forget about it and put it back in the refrigerator and come back and find it 3 or 6 months later, we'll start to see mold growth on it.
Yeah.
I love the silage analogy you've got here with the silage face and yeast and molds, and I see where you're going.
Yeah, it's no different. That's the same issues we have in silage. So if we want to protect our meats with oxygen barriers, and we want to protect our cheeses with oxygen barrier plastic, doesn't it just make sense that we could protect our silage with oxygen barrier plastics? And we should. So it comes down to 2 things. One is, there's a financial benefit because I'll have more feed left over, or I just won't shrink it as much because I protected the feed from being deteriorated by oxygen. Or another way to think about it, I protected the top meter of my feed from composting.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's what's going on. But also when it composts, let's think about it this way. If I have a compost row, right? How do I get this row that's, just say, a meter tall? How do I get it to shrink down? Well, I go in there and I turn it and I turn oxygen into it. It heats up and then it, shrinks.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? That's the exact opposite of a silage. Or that is what is happening in your silage if we don't keep the oxygen out of it, particularly in the top 3 feet. Now, we're not going into the silage and turning it, so it doesn't seem as extreme as a compost row, but that's exactly what's happening.
So really, your recommendation is go and use an oxygen barrier sheet.
Pretty simple.
So as you mentioned cheese, I thought that led us a nice one to maybe talk about additives, because let's be honest, cheese, yogurts all use the correct what's the word? Not yeast. What's the word I'm looking for?
Enzyme starters.
But starters to get
cultures,
them going. Yeah, cultures. Sorry, I just couldn't find the word I was looking for. Thank you. So again, what's your thought on using additives?
Well, so, full disclosure, I've worked for additive companies for most of my career, so I know a lot about it. Full disclosure, at this point in time, I also have my own additive company that happens to be called Cultures, because in the U.S., we call those products, in general, we call them silage inoculants. Now, in other parts of the world, you would say additives or inoculants. But what they are is live lactic acid bacteria that are added to the crop at the time of chopping and harvesting to help enhance the fermentation. And there's lots of different companies that make these types of organisms, and so there's lots of different products on the market. Now, luckily for you folks in Europe, you have a little bit more regulation over that. In the U.S., I mean, it's very easy for anybody to come up with a product, and you don't have to prove that it's efficacious to sell it in the market. Now you can only, fool me once, fool me twice. You can only fool a farmer once, and then you're pretty much out of it. But the point being is that these organisms are beneficial.
Yep.
In general, so I'd say choose a science-based, research-backed type of product to go. So there's kind of two trains of thought in this, in my mind, and maybe there's three. But the way I always approach it is I like to go out and see the farm, see the feed, understand what the issues the farmers are dealing with, and then based upon those criteria, then you make selections on what type of product to use.
Yep.
So let me give you an example. So two different kind of scenarios. Grass silages, we tend to put up grass silages, alfalfa or lucerne silages, clover silages. We tend to put them up a little bit wetter.
Yep.
In general, especially in the northern climates in the UK. Now in the West, we've gone to extreme, and now we're putting those feeds up extremely dry. And actually, where I live, we don't have any grass silage, but we would have a lot of alfalfa production here in Idaho. So, but generally speaking, we'd put them up. Let's just say, let's pick a number below 35 dry matter.
Yep.
Okay. And why is that? Well, part of that's climate related. We grow grasses in areas where we get a lot of rainfall.
Yeah.
That's why we don't have grass where I live. I'm in a high desert climate, so we don't grow grass silages. But we'll see it on the west coast of Oregon and Washington, where we get a lot of rain that's coming in right off of the coast. We'll also see it in the Northeast, in New York and Vermont and Pennsylvania. We'll grow grass silages up there. So it's very kind of climate specific. And of course, in the UK, we'd have a lot more moisture and rainfall, and that's why another reason why you grow grass. So we harvest that crop, we wilt the crop. Now, hopefully we wilt it long enough that we get it to a dry matter that allows us to put it up and avoid some of the problems that we're going to have. And what's the main problem, Andrew, if we put it up too wet?
You got me stumped there now to think that's my brain's context.
Well, so we'd see it go Clostridium
yes.
or butyric.
Yes,
right?
Butyric. Yes, sorry, my brain just went there.
No, that's all right. That's all right. But I mean, maybe it didn't happen in the UK, so maybe I was going to learn something there. But in general, if we put something up.
Well,
it does.
For most people, if you've got butyric, it's the smell about it. That's when you know it's gone butyric, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. So the general connect the dots of how this happens. We take a wetter feed, we lay it down on the ground to wilt it. Well, now it's in contact with the soil, it's in contact with dirt. In the soil, when we rake that feed, we turn it, right, to try to get it to dry, or tet it to try to get it to dry a little bit more. And now we have a rainstorm coming. And so, goodness, we've got to get this feed out of the field before it rains, or it's just going to sit there and get rained on. We know the quality's going to go south on us. We're going to have issues so we got to get it done, right? So we pick this feed up, we take it to the silage clamp, we start to pack it. We've packed more soil into it, more dirt contamination into it, which is where the spores of Clostridia live. Now it's a wet environment. These spores, then they dominate the fermentation, and they produce butyric acid. And they produce butyric acid or butyrate by consuming nitrogen-based components of the feed, which is protein, right?
Yeah, protein, yeah.
So now they're damaging our protein quality, but yet they're producing butyric acid, which, as you mentioned, smells terrible.
Yeah.
right? And so then we open this silage later, and it smells so bad that nothing wants to eat it.
Yeah.
Right. So interesting on this too. I've never heard a lot of silage people talk about this, but butyric acid is also very caustic. And what I mean by that is it has a strong pKa, and that's scientific terms. So I won't bore people with that. But I had a cattle feeder in the state of Washington one time tell me that he actually tasted a butyric silage. It's like, whoa, that's pretty crazy. Do you know what, do you have any idea what made that? He goes, well, what I wanted to do, he goes, I was putting molasses and everything I could. I let the stuff, aerate for days. I could not get the cattle to eat this. So he goes, I wanted to see what was so bad about this stinky feed that cattle didn't want to eat. And he said, I took a piece of this triticale silage which is like a rye or wheat silage.
Yep.
He said, I put it in my mouth, and instantly it was like eating the hottest ghost pepper or habanero pepper you've ever had in your life, put it in your mouth, and my lips just completely burned and my tongue just completely burned for the rest of the day.
Wow.
So we think cows don't want to eat it because it smells like poop, right?
Yeah, but it's not. It is. I mean, I used to have a 2IC when I was in Victoria, Kiwi, and as far as he was concerned, he used to try every bit of food the cows were going to have, because he said, well, if I don't want to eat it, no cow's going to want to eat it.
Yep. So here's a trivia for you. So what animal has the largest olfactory system?
Largest what, sorry?
Olfactory system. They sense the smell.
Oh, sense of smell.
Don't they have something like 10 times the sense of smell that we do as humans? There's some sort of fact
it's greater
about
than
it,
that.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's greater than that. But when we think about smells and how we perceive them, it's also affected with our taste buds. So like right now, you can probably tell I'm dealing with a little bit of a sinus congestion and a nose cold, right? I don't taste food as well as, when we do that. So, but the question's interesting is that the African elephant, and everybody, oh, wow, that makes, everybody thinks it's a bloodhound or a dog or, something like that, but it's actually the African elephant. Well, it should be. It's got an 8-foot long nose. For goodness sake, it ought to be able to, it ought to be able to smell well. And how they measure these things, I don't know, but researchers say they can smell a pride of lions from, say, 5 miles away, which if that's true, that's amazing. But cows would rank number 2 on the list. And it's like, well, get your hands on a cow in lockup. So it's like, look how big that nose is, but then look how big the surface area of that tongue is.
Yeah.
Yeah, surely palatability is important to a cow. Have we ever dealt with sorting issues as a nutritionist?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Why do we think that is? Why does a cow want to sort?
Yeah, because she doesn't want to eat
the fact that they're curious. There's something that they don't like about the taste, the smell, the flavor, whatever. It's like being a 4-year-old. Like got grandkids like that. They pick through what's on the plate.
my kids, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they're picky, right? So a cow can be picky too. So it's funny, nutritionists. I see this all the time. They look at one NIR analysis lab report, if you will, of a silage, and they go, "Oh, that's a high quality silage," because they look at fiber and fiber digestibility. But they didn't look at anything else that might actually say, will the cow actually eat this stuff?
Yeah.
Because if she won't eat it, I don't care what the paper says. And this is where, as nutrition type people or nutritionists, so we deal with this. Well, the paper said this and the computer said that, but the cows told me something completely different. Well, maybe your feeds just taste like garbage.
To be honest, it's one of the first things I was taught when I started to do nutrition by someone was cows can't read. It doesn't matter what the computer says. It doesn't matter what the paper says. It's what the cow's telling you, because they can't read. They're not going to do what you think they're going to do. They're going to do what they want to do. So follow their lead. Yeah.
Well, the computer also never got dirty and walked behind the cows to see what the cows were doing, either in front or behind the cows, right? And so how's the computer know, right? So obviously the people that program the software, are nutrition people. But the point is there's a lot of variables that are going on here, and we sometimes discount what is that palatability experience for the cow. I know if I go out to eat at a nice restaurant, I'm okay with spending a lot of money on a really high quality dining experience and having that meal was great. But there's nothing worse than going out to a really expensive location and go, that food sucked.
Yes.
That was terrible. That was the worst experience. Why did I pay so much for that? Well, the cow's got to deal with that every day if we're putting up those kinds of feeds. So again, that was a long way of going back to, Andrew. It's like, well, should we use these additives? Yes, because we want to avoid those negative experiences those cows could have. Because they're also going to have them every single meal of every single day until I get rid of that feed. And hopefully I didn't make another nasty feed that I'm expecting these cows to have to eat.
Well, exactly. You've got to use it sometimes, isn't it? It's as simple as that. You can't just leave a whole pile go to waste because you can't afford it. On additives, what are your thoughts on homo or hetero cultures?
Yeah, so they each have a role to play. They're important to understand what their differences are, because I think a lot of people don't, and it can get really confusing when you start using these, big words like homofermentative and heterofermentative. So let's understand what they are first. So a homofermentative would be a lactic acid bacteria strain that homo, meaning like, only, essentially only produces lactic acid. And so that's great. And so what that does is we put those types of organisms into the fermentation. We get a fast, rapid drop of pH. And because we get a fast pickling is what's going on here, right? Just like making a pickle. We pickle this crop very, very quickly. And therefore, we preserve more dry matter of the fermentation process. Remember, we were talking earlier about how if we had all these variables and we had a lot of compaction issues, or we had some moisture issues, we had some oxygen issues still present in that feed, we're going to get some additional heating produced. Well, that's a sign of a lower quality fermentation.
Yep.
The way to think about this is the higher the temperature increase means I probably didn't have a very good fermentation. The lower the temperature increase is also a sign that, well, maybe I probably had a better fermentation. Well, how do I get a better fermentation? I control the fermentation by adding the organisms that are going to make the fermentation, because otherwise I'm just rolling the dice and counting on Mother Nature. Well, that's where those Clostridial organisms came from that caused your butyric feed. It wasn't magic. Right? It wasn't a Harry Potter scenario that somebody came out with a wand and touched that feed and poof, you magically had, there's my British reference there, right? But,
it's a good one. It's a good one.
Yeah. I don't get Hogwarts silage, by accident. These microbes do the fermentation. So it's like I can take the microbes that I have no idea what they are. It's just God, Mother Nature, whatever you want to believe in, gave us. It's sitting there on the crop. Or I can add the microbes to it to try to control the fermentations. So we started at one point this talking about cheese.
Yep.
Does the cheese plant just randomly sit there and throw the milk into the vat and roll the dice and say, oh, please turn into cheddar? Oh, please turn into Swiss cheese? Do you think they do that? You think that'd be a very successful business if they ran it that way? Of course not. They know exactly what they're going to produce because they add the cultures in there to give them the types of cheeses to get them to the end point. Well, we can do the same thing with silage. So homo strains, I know I'm rambling here, but homo strains make only lactic acid. So that's great. I get a pickling and a drop of the pH, but that doesn't necessarily control yeast. That doesn't necessarily control molds, and that doesn't necessarily control Clostridias.
Yep.
So I solved one problem, but it's single trait selection. And where I'm getting at is a lot of producers will say, oh, all these products are the same, and so I'll just use the cheapest one. Well, usually if that's your criteria, your criteria is also, well, I'm only going to choose, these homo fermenters because they are cheaper to produce by the manufacturers, and they don't have any special research to go along with them, and they just make lactic acid, and you're just going to get an upfront fermentation, pH drop, and some dry matter recovery. But when I go to open the feed, all of that's forgotten, and none of that matters anymore 3 or 6 months later when I open the feed.
Can I just interrupt you there, Eric? One of the
course.
things that I always think of with looking at that cost thing, if we are just going down that the single strain route and the price, we really want to be looking at the amount of bacteria that we're getting for that price, don't we? That's really key to what we're trying to look at. But actually, it's going to be cheaper if we're supplying less bacteria, being supplied less bacteria in the first place.
Well, that's only part of it. Okay, and so this is where it gets very, very complicated. So we would measure that, generally speaking, by CFUs, or colony forming units, and the manufacturers would put that on their labels and say we have this many CFUs per gram of forage. So that can be a criteria. That's a strength of an inoculant, if you will, or but that's not necessarily true, because there is so much variation in strain to strain, just like there's so much variation in Homo sapiens. Okay, so when we talk about Homo sapiens, we're talking about a genus, the Homo, and species.
Yeah.
Right. So Homo sapiens sapiens would be in the species there. So I'm probably the tallest out of the three of us. I'm 6'5".
6'6", I'm afraid.
Oh, okay. Well, then there we go. So, but there's a lot of variation in this, right? Does that mean you're a better basketball player than me?
No.
It could be. But I know LeBron James is a better basketball player, and we could put 10 of us out there against LeBron James, and it wouldn't matter. We could put, because we see that when he plays against 5 professional basketball players. Sometimes it just doesn't matter. So let's put him against 10 of us. You think he could probably still beat 10 of us? Probably. He could probably beat 20 of us. So sometimes it's not a numbers game if you don't have a specialist that knows what they're doing. Now, again, in the European market, you guys are pretty lucky, I guess, because these products have to be registered, and so there's government agencies and bodies that would require that these products have some testing. Yes. Where in other parts of the world, like in the US, we don't necessarily have that. So people could say, "Oh, I've got a gazillion bugs." Okay, well, then that must be better. Well, if they don't know what they're doing and they don't know how to play basketball, I don't really care. If they're all 3 foot tall Oompa Loompas, I put 1 million of them out on the court. That's not going to stop a LeBron James type of situation. So I don't know if that's a good analogy, but pick your best footballer and then
they need not just to be number, they need to be the right bugs to do what you're doing.
Right. And it really comes down to, okay, not just what is my end goal, which where I started was go look at the feed, and the feed should tell us what we need. So if I'm dealing with a butyric problem, meaning I have Clostridia in my fields, it's getting into my feeds, it's getting into my silos, my bunkers, my clamps. I need to try to figure out how can I reduce my risks of that. Well, it might be your harvesting equipment. Maybe we're mowing that feed or swathing that feed too low to the ground. Maybe we're raking it too often. Maybe we're using old raking technology and we need to be using mergers. You know, so there's ways that we can reduce that, and that would show up on your lab analysis as ash. So we need to be looking at our ash levels when we run our feed samples to decide, do we have too much in here? We also need to be looking at our moistures. Maybe because I'm always putting up my grass silage at 28 dry matter, maybe that's a contributing factor, and it is. Maybe that's a contributing factor to why I keep having butyric feeds. Maybe if I wilted that for 6 more hours or 1 more day, that number would change and my risk would go down. There are some products out there that specifically deal with Clostridia, and it's not a CFU game. It's not a numbers game. It's a specific strain that's been selected for killing Clostridia. So that's a different way of thinking about it. So, and that strain happens to be a homo fermenter, but you can't just say, well, all homo fermenters are created equal if we know those things, if we have that science and that technology available to us. So again, it goes back to looking at my risks. If I don't have the risk of Clostridia, there is zero reason why I should use that product.
Yep. Yeah.
Right, but well, it's priced good. Well, who cares? I don't have that problem. Why would I do it? Why would I use that on corn silage? The risk of corn silage, do we wilt corn silage, lay it on the ground and roll it up and pick it up later? Do I put it up at 20 dry matter or 25 dry matter? Not normally. So the risk of it going butyric is very, very, very low. Although occasionally we'll see some butyrate in corn silage, but the corn silage ferments very well because it's got a ton of sugar in it. It's got a ton of carbohydrates in it. Hell, it's a grain crop, right?
Yeah.
So we have different scenarios there. You know what likes to thrive off of all these water-soluble carbohydrates? Yeast and molds.
Yeah.
Makes sense, right? So, well, if I know I'm prone to yeast and molds, why would I just use a lactic acid producer? You know what? A lot of these in the scientific literature, we talk about these yeast. They're lactate assimilating yeasts. It's a fancy way of saying yeast that'll eat lactic acid.
Yeah.
So if I don't do anything to control the yeasts, I just made a party for them. So I don't mention this. I get the upfront fermentation by the homo fermenters, but I go to open it up 6 months later. Who cares what happened 6 months ago? Because now I have the ultimate enemy again, which is oxygen. And now I just made a lot of lactic acid. And if I didn't kill the yeast, well, then so what? Now they have everything that they need to have a party, which means they're going to heat your feed.
Yeah, secondary fermentation.
Secondary fermentation, yeah. And those losses are much greater on the back end than they are on the front end. And that's where the hetero-fermenting type of strains come into play, because they do make more than just lactic acid. Generally speaking, they'll make lactic acid and acetic acid, and the acetic acid is more antifungal. So it does a better job of killing and controlling yeast and molds, well, then you get and so nobody really markets at least in the North American market anymore. Nobody has a straight hetero fermenter, let's just call it what it really is, Lactobacillus buchneri. That is the strain of choice that does these things, that kills the yeast and molds. What we see is combination products. So they'll have lactic acid bacteria that are homofermenters in combination with heterofermenters. And now I hopefully get the best of both worlds. I get the upfront fermentation by getting the pH drop really quickly by these strains that just produce lactic acid. And then I get the back end protection, or reducing my risk of secondary reheating or secondary re-fermentation, because the Lactobacillus buchneri produce some acetic acid that help control yeast and molds. And that's an oversimplification of it. And there's lots of companies that have different types or technologies of heterofermenters or homofermenters. Lactobacillus buchneri is not the only good strain out there, but it's been in the marketplace for over 2 decades. So it's the one that most people are familiar with.
So you hear that one, that's the one that's usually mentioned whenever you talk about these.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
But there's an example of CFUs. When the product originally came out, at least in the U.S. market, it was brought to the U.S. market by a company from Wales called Biotol.
Yep.
And so it came here from Biotol, which was quickly purchased by Lallemand Animal Nutrition. Yep. And at that time, nobody knew who Lallemand was. People say Lallemand. They couldn't pronounce it. Lallemand now is a global player in this market, as we know. But they were, they had a facility that they purchased at least in the U.S. in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I used to work for them, so I know all this stuff to be true because I was there when that product was brought in. And that was a 400,000 CFU product of a strain called Lactobacillus buchneri 40788 or 40788, probably more correct, but everybody said 40. But that was at a super high, at that time, level CFU count.
Yeah.
Well, other companies since then, and again, that was 2 decades ago or more, actually, showing my age, that's where all this gray hair came from. There are other companies that have similar performing Lactobacillus buchneri strains that don't require such a high CFU count. That because they just grow faster, or they grow under different conditions. We don't talk about this very much, but the temperature, the ambient temperature, we talked about it earlier, but the ambient temperature at which we put up that feed, what impact does that have on these strains and their ability to grow? You think they grow different at 20 Celsius than 30 Celsius?
Definitely.
You think they grow different on a wilted crop that's more protein than a sugar type crop or a carbohydrate based crop, a starch crop, right? Like corn silage. They do. They grow absolutely different. But yet we always expect them to do the same thing. And then, of course, if they don't work, it's our fault.
So you really need to understand the purpose of that particular inoculant to be able to choose the right one for you.
Yeah. And I used to, and I agree with that, Sarah, and very few people can do that because there's so many products and there's so many different techniques. And so again, to me, it goes back, the other way to look at this as from the farm level or the nutritious level is, what are our risks? What are our problems that we have in our feed, on our farm, and what is the best way to mitigate those risks? Because mitigating those risks, regardless of what it costs, is cheaper than having the problem.
Yep.
Because dealing with a 12-month supply of maize silage that is heating, that is full of yeast, which is going to upset digestibilities, which is full of mold, which is going to bring mycotoxins potentially, which is unpalatable, which means cows aren't going to eat. So my dry matter intakes are going to be low, which is going to protect flow, which is going to protect or impact components. The only one that wins here is the veterinarian.
Yeah. Because
they're dealing with sick cows. Like those issues start in the feed and they do start here. And so,
or the binder supplier.
Yeah, they make a lot of money on these things. So people get, using, or the acid. Somebody's going to end up selling you a buffered acid later because your TMR is heating.
Yeah.
We know how to solve all of those problems by fermenting it properly and putting up hygienic feeds during the ensiling process. But that only starts with where we started this whole discussion, having a game plan.
Yeah, being prepared.
So, all of these things are impactful, and the decisions we make now, we're going to be dealing with, potentially a year from now, if we put up that, volume of feed, So, we have a lot of customers here and clients that we deal with in the United States that will have a 18-month supply of feed, fermented feeds. Yeah, It is wow. It's fantastic. But there's some risks in that too, right? One is I got inventory, I got money tied up in this, right? I got to go to my banker and say, hey, I'm gonna invest a couple $100,000, $1 million, and let it sit there for a year and a half and not make any money off of it. And okay, well that's great, but it's better than being hey, we got to cut this and ferment it for a day and feed it tomorrow, right? Because we're out of feed. So it's a different situation. But what are the risks of that feed that's going to sit there for over a year before I feed it? What if I get holes in my plastic system and I get exposure to oxygen? Oh, okay. That's a problem. What if I'm counting on that feed to be excellent and I get in there and it's subpar? And you go, ooh, this feed isn't as good as I thought it was. Just because it sat there for 12 months, that was 12 months of opportunity for it to shrink more.
You mentioned oxygen there, made me just think of a question for you. What's your thoughts on in terms of once you sheet it and sealed it? Obviously, we talked about an oxygen barrier, but as a kid, I remember being told it was tire butt to butt and the whole thing should be weighed down as much as possible. Yet these days, more and more, you're saying, oh yeah, as long as you've got gravel bags along the edges and along the joins, that's okay. But that's just not putting the same kind of weight on these pits, is it, as what we would have done historically?
Yeah. There's all kinds of thoughts in that too. So what we see, which would blow everybody's mind in the UK, is we're using sidewalls. So we're taking an automobile tire, and we're cutting the two outsides of it. So we got two little thin donuts, and then we have the treads, which would be the treads. So we take one tire and turn it into three pieces.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we do that too. Yeah, it saves the old water down the wellies problem that we all been through, haven't we, with putting tires or taking tires off the pit.
But
and getting mosquitoes in there. But now we've just dramatically reduced our weight, right? And I like to look at it as like how much weight per square meter or square foot that we're putting on there. And that's why the gravel bags, I think, work, is because now I'm putting a 50-pound piece of material there in such a small area, say 1.5 feet linear, but it's only maybe 6 inches wide. So if you look at that on a square foot basis, well, that's actually a tremendous amount of weight that we're putting there. Versus if I use one of these automobile sidewalls that only weighs 2 or 3 pounds. They're really not very heavy.
Is that because we've changed some of the machinery that we use, though, in compaction, that we'd perhaps be using, heavier compactors and that side of things, so actually getting more air out of it before we actually sheet it, and can therefore get away with putting less weight on it? Is that one of the reasons that we can get away with that? Or
it's possible, although I would say we're going to run into a conundrum here at some point in time. I've been to Agritechnica. You guys have probably been to Eurotier. Those big farm shows in Europe. I've been to what we call the World Ag Expo in Tulare, California. It's the largest farm show in North America. I've been to all of those. If you go to any of those, and I have, and you meet with Klaas or John Deere or New Holland or Krone, or nobody's there showing you their new 2-row pull behind.
Yeah.
But they've got something that's got 1,000 horsepower.
Yeah.
Oh, and then next to them, there's some other implement company that now you can take your standard 8-row header and put on a 12-row or a 16-row. The problem is we are going to accelerate our rates of harvest because of the contracting business, because of the custom harvesting business, because their business is RPM, it's not NDF.
Yeah, you remind me of, like, I've got a client, and for 2 years running, he had his maize collapse, and we had a mycotoxin problem. And we sat down and thought about it, what went wrong. And he said, that's what it came down to, is his contractor had 6 trailers, and you'd have all those 6 trailers within 10 minutes. So the guy on the pit was just pushing them up, but wasn't rolling it properly, wasn't doing a proper job. And then they'd sit there for half an hour. Rather than spacing those trailers out, they were just trying to ram them through as quickly as possible. And whereas they should have been evened out, like, I don't know, every 5 minutes you had a trailer rather than everything within 10 minutes. And you end up with problems on the pit because it's not compacted properly. And so we ended up with mycotoxin problems, and his cows just fell off a cliff.
Yeah, sure. So it's a delivery rate problem.
Yeah.
So the University of Wisconsin has some, and unfortunately they're all retiring too. So that's another reason why I'm trying to do this. Some just incredibly good agricultural engineers. And so you can go, I'd encourage anybody to Google this, Wisconsin team, like a football team, Wisconsin Team Forage, and they have a tremendous amount of resources there. One of these days I'll link them and put them on my website, but I'm just not good at doing websites. But in that, you'll look for a bunker silo density calculator, and it's an Excel spreadsheet. And we've had it for a long time, and people still don't even know it exists. But what I like to do with the bunker density calculator is go in and look at that scenario. So Andrew, you could go with that particular client there, and you could input what was the dry matter of the feed.
Yep.
In his scenario, what was the delivery rate? So how many tons per hour were being delivered to that silo? What was the packing weight of that piece of equipment that he was packing with? And if you don't know it, it always frustrates me because it's like, well, I don't know what that weighs. Well, don't you have a scale on your farm? How the heck do you weigh and purchase commodities? You trust the feed company on everything? Our big farms all have scales, and yet they don't weigh their packing equipment. But you can also go to another website called tractordata.com.
Yep.
And put in anything, including stuff you've never heard of from Asia or South America or what, all over the world, and you can put in the specs of your machine and it'll tell you what it weighs. So you can use that factor. Yeah, so that's a really cool resource I've been using for years. So, if you don't know what a John Deere 7450 weighs, you can go look it up either at John Deere or you can go look it up there. It's my point. So take that factor and put it in there. And then think about the another factor that is really critical in silage density or compaction quality is layer thickness. And let's be honest, when we get slammed with 6 trailer loads of feed all at once, all that pack tractor operator is trying to do is get all of that feed out of the way, up and into the clamper, up and into the bunker, onto the pile, before the next 6 loads come, and he gets literally buried alive, by all of this stuff. And so he's pushing that up, and he is not getting a thin layer. So we can actually mathematically with this calculator predict what our density is going to be. In fact, it's the only way for me today that I do densities whatsoever. Now, it is too dangerous to go to a face of a silo and drill a hole and extract the feed and adjust for dry matter and come up with the density. I refuse to do it. I won't go into a pile that's, and you must be the same way because we're about the same height, Andrew. If you reach up, you can touch 8 feet tall.
Yeah.
That for me is the maximum amount of height. So if I'm on a large pile, or if I'm on a large bunker, I won't go in it. If I'm on a large drive over pile, I'll only work on the wings only about that high. So the feed's only a foot or two above, and I just won't walk into the center because it's just too dangerous. So probing there on those wings is a completely different density than if I probe at the top or if I probe right in the middle of the. So if I'm going to pull a cigar of feed, if you will, out of a core of feed out of that silo, that's only telling me of the density of that point, at that moment, at that location, at that time. And a week from now, when I go back, even if I drill at the same height and the same, air quotes, the same area, it's going to be different. Because that was different feed that was put up a week later. All of those things are different, right? So, what I like to do is go through that scenario of using the spreadsheet then, and then use that to, let's look at that farm scenario and let's be honest. What did we really pack with? What was the true delivery rate? We could estimate very closely with that what our density is. And then we go, okay, is there room for improvement? And if there is room for improvement, how? Well, maybe I take that 6 trailer loads and I cut that to 5. Now your contractor's not going to like that.
Well, you say we've got to remember if we're the farmer's the one paying the bill, so he's the one that should be having some control over what's coming in from his contractor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, think of it this way though, and you're absolutely right, Andrew. There's not enough guys that do that. They go, well, if I tell him to do it that way, he'll just tell me to, off, and I'm going to go to the next farm. And it's like, well, okay, well then find someone else that will work with you, because he doesn't have to feed the cows for the next 12 months. You have to feed the cows for the next 12 months. You have to deal with the mycotoxin issue. You have to deal with sick cows. Those are problems we shouldn't have to deal with just because somebody's inconvenienced by doing things. If all 6 of those trailers showed up in a 10-minute period, that means the chopper's probably sitting still for 50 minutes out of an hour. He filled them all real quick, and then he's sitting there waiting around. So it might be actually more efficient to run 3 trailers. Or, another situation might be, okay, I'm going to bag a portion of the feed. It's maybe like making that cook down pile, if you will.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Instead of sending all 6 trailers to that bunker where I know I don't have room to it, I don't have another bunker, another clamp to put that feed in. I want to relieve some of that pressure off of that silo by sending 1 out of every 5 trucks to the bagger, and then we'll just make a small bag. And it's really not because we want to feed out of a bag. Not that there's anything wrong with bags, but I'm just saying, like, that wouldn't be our ideal scenario. We'd rather feed out of the clamp because of all the efficiencies it gives us, but we've taken pressure off of that. And it doesn't, the other issue that we're going to have is as we increase our delivery rates, yeah, Sarah, you're right. We want to increase our packing weight of our tractor, but at some point in time, the clamp is only so big.
Yeah.
Are you going to be able to put in a, 4-wheel drive, articulated, dually 500 horsepower tractor like we do in the US? We have tractors that we just strictly call a pack tractor for these very, very large drive over piles. And all they do is compact feed. They're too damn big to use to farm. You can't pull a plow with them. Like you really can't. You can push snow with them. You can put a blade on them and do a few other things. But in general, we push and pack silage with that piece of equipment.
Yeah.
Because we're not dealing with the walls of a clamp or a bunker now. We're dealing with a drive over pile, which we still don't get right because people want to do it their way instead of doing it like with a game plan in place. And they look at a piece of land and go, oh, well, then we should just make it here. And it's 30 feet tall when it should only be 20 feet tall. And now it's too dangerous to work on. And we have compaction issues. And so just because we have big equipment doesn't mean that we get it right too.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the benefit of, or is there a benefit of having a second tractor doing that consolidation? So take one of the tractors off the trailer, or take a trailer off one of the tractors and have 2 on the pit.
Well, it's a function of weight. Right. And so it's a function of the amount of weight that we're putting on. I like to call it an iron deficiency. A lot of times I see a poorly packed silage. I go, oh, you got an iron deficiency. And they look at me like I'm crazy. It's like, iron deficiency. It's like, no, you didn't put enough steel. You didn't put enough iron on this pile when you packed it. But if we're dealing in a clamp scenario, we have a limited amount of real estate. Right. We got walls that we're dealing with. We can't get a giant piece of equipment in a small box.
I mean,
we all like to say
still got roofs on some here as well.
Yeah.
Right. So we can only get so much. We see roofs in British Columbia, in Western Canada.
Putting more roofs on them.
Yeah. Now, I'm looking at the time, and I think we could just keep going, to be honest with you. But I mean, really, Eric, thank you for your time. But really, any last words of wisdom that you'd like to? I don't really want to cut us off, but unfortunately, looking at the time, we need to. But any last words of wisdom from yourself?
Well, let's let your listeners decide if they want to cut us off, and if they send you some messages and say, hey, let's continue that, then just send me an email, and we'll do part 2. That's what we had to do on the last podcast.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, words of wisdom is start with a game plan, get your consulting group around you, know what the game plan is, be honest, and go out and evaluate your feeds now and go, yeah, we have problems. Not everything's perfect. And if it did come out perfect, fantastic. Congratulations. Kudos to you. What did we do to get that perfect result? How do we replicate that again? Because we're going to have different conditions again. And so we need to know what the game plan is for dealing with this. This is why we have head coaches. Who is enabled to make the decision when something goes awry and when we need to zig and we should have zagged and those types of things. So it's like, who's going to make those decisions? Is it the contractor?
Yeah. Or
is the contractor involved in sitting here and seeing your feeds, or if he only shows up once a year? And it sounds like I'm beating up on contractors. I'm not trying to, but is your contractor coming and seeing your issues and seeing how your cows react to these feeds, or is he simply just supplying? And many of them do those things, or is he simply just supplying, a service to you of equipment?
Yeah.
So, but start with that game plan now. And then, of course, if you need help, there's tremendous good resources available on the internet. A lot of them here are in the US, but they're available globally now. And, you can certainly reach out to me. I have my own website. I'm always happy to coach and teach people through this. It's called silagemAtters.com. Because I think there's a lot of things in silage, like dry matters, that are important, and compaction matters, and application of inoculants matter, and choosing the right inoculant matters. There's all these things that matter, but planning matters. And then the final thing I just say is that safety matters. This is a very dangerous business. We know that being around cows all the time, but think of it this way: we don't do the silage activity every day. It's been a while since we've done it. It's been months since we've done it. We're dealing with heavy equipment. We're dealing with dangerous type of equipment. We're dealing with different weather conditions. We're dealing with long hours. So
time pressures.
We get
Definitely.
we get tired, we get complacent. So I would encourage also everybody to visit silagesafety.org. silagesafety.org. That was a program that Dr. Keith Bolson put together. I happen to be one of the members of the Bolson Silage Safety Foundation. There's a video that's on there. Unfortunately, you'd have to listen to me, but there's a 13-minute video that you can get for free and play it right off of that website. I'd encourage you to do that when you're doing your planning with your farm crew and everybody that's harvesting. Make them listen to it. Make them watch that video.
That is a fair shout, because interestingly, I was recently asked to go take some silage samples at a biodigester, and before I could even walk on the place, I had to have a method statement of how I was going to do it. They did a risk assessment, and then before I could even walk in to do it, I had to watch a 15-minute induction video about safety on the site. And it just makes you think that as an industry, we are so far behind in some of the things we do, and that's why we have some of the problems we have in terms of deaths, etc. Is because we as you say, it's a good shout. Be safe, whatever you're doing, be safe. And I'm not saying some of that you might say we're going over the top with, but it was just a complete comparison of, I just walk on a farm, I take a silage sample. It's made me think, well, actually, if I go on a farm, sometimes I nip in, nip out, grab a sample as I'm passing. I need to make sure I've got a high-vis vest on, because if they don't know I'm there, Absolutely. I'm just nipping in and out, I should have that high-vis vest on. Whereas, I had to wear a high-vis vest, I had to wear a hat, I had to wear safety boots, all of these things, just completely different.
Yep. Yeah, it's very important. It's very dangerous, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do the same thing. I do a lot of in and outs real quick on farms. That feeder didn't know I was going to be there that day. Nobody knew I was. I didn't always have an appointment. Foolish of me to go there without safety gear. I mean, so you can see, like, I got an orange hat back here on the shelf. Always high vis clothing. That kind of thing. Like, why would I do that? That's disrespectful to those people that work there on that operation, to put the risk on them that they're supposed to see me.
Yeah.
So anyway, the videos up there at silagesafety.org. I'd encourage anybody to go look at that. I do a full. That's just the short version. I do full-on trainings with that last like this. Well over an hour if anybody's interested in that. So. Pleasure to spend time with you guys today. And there's a lot more we could talk about, but we'll just have to save that for another day.
Exactly. Maybe we might take you up on an offer and follow it up again. And Sarah, any thoughts from yourself?
I think the take-home message that I got from the discussion really is to actually look backwards almost before we look forwards. What went well last year and what can we do differently this year? What is the opportunity to change? So not what was the challenge of last year's, but actually put that into that positive spin, and actually what can we do differently this year to actually make that difference?
Yeah. And that's why I agree, Sarah. And I've just tried to coach people that, farmers don't want to go out and look and see the problems, because then that means they did something wrong. It's like, no. Yeah, for whatever reason, it isn't ideal, but that just means there's an opportunity to improve. And if we're not constantly trying to improve in anything that we do in our life, then what's the purpose, right? I mean, are we satisfied with the level of milk production that we had 10 years ago? Is that what your clients are telling you? Oh, just give me the same amount of milk we had 10 years ago. Of course not.
Yeah.
They're constantly striving for more milk production. Well, it feeds the highest part of our costs. And we know a cow's a ruminant. She's not necessarily desiring to have all of this concentrate purchased from the feed company. She can make milk if you give her good forage. Let's give her good forage.
Exactly. Just treat everything as a learning experience. It's all a learning experience. It might not have gone well, but it's still a learning experience of how not to do it next time. But really, on that note, it's time to say goodbye. So I'd like to again thank Eric for his time. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm hoping people enjoy yourself, because I say just somebody different, and say, as you've said, just talking through this, they're all the same problems as what we get over here.
Yeah.
So you know. Hopefully people can learn something from it. So on that note, I guess I'd like to say it's a goodbye from me.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the time. It was a pleasure.
The pleasure talking to you, Eric.
Thank you for listening to the Chewing the Cud podcast, a podcast of the UK dairy industry brought to you from the southwest of England and listened to around the world. And now for the really boring bit, I'm afraid, the legal disclaimer. The information provided during this podcast has been prepared for general information purposes only and does not constitute advice. The information must not be relied upon for any purpose and no representation or warranty is given to its accuracy, completeness or otherwise. Any reference to other organisations, businesses or products during this podcast are not endorsements or recommendations of Chewing the Cud Limited. The views of Andrew Jones are personal and may not be the views of Chewing the Cud Limited, and the views of Sarah Bolt are personal and may not be the views of Kingsafe Farming and Conservation Limited and any affiliated companies. For more information on the podcast and details of services offered by Chewing the Cud Limited, visit www.chewingthecud.com. Thank you and goodbye.